these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Honored today to have my friend Jake Auchincloss on, and a Democrat to boot. This is, we don't get many. That's not always true. So we like to have respectful policy disagreements, sometimes on the podcast. But today it's more about agreement. We both work on, you're on the cartel task force with me. You've been a great supporter of that. Appreciate it. You show up to meetings. That says a lot. And you're also on the China Select Committee. So there's some overlap here when we talk about fentanyl precursors. And so we wanted to dive into a little bit of that today. And then I'll ask you about Kamala Harris. Just, where do we even begin? I mean, what's your reflections? I mean, I've got mine from my, deep dive into the cartels and mapping out the precursors or the precursor supply chain. Mm-hmm. You guys just started a working group at the Select Committee on China on fentanyl specifically. So, what was the impetus for that, and how's that going? And I'm wondering if you guys find anything different than what what we've seen on the cartel side.
Thanks for having me on. And origin of my interest in this, as with most issues, is this intersection of a personal backstory and district needs.
Yeah.
So I was
what is that? Yeah.
Marine reconnaissance officer, and I led a combined special operations mission in conjunction with Colombian Special Forces to Panama in 2014. And we trained the Panamanian public forces on how to do drug interdiction patrols. And that was my introduction to U.S. drug interdiction strategy. And it's stayed with me as an area of interest.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I represent the Massachusetts 4th. It's the suburbs of Boston all the way through the border of Rhode Island. And unfortunately, parts of my district were early in the opioid epidemic.
Yeah.
And we're losing 100,000 Americans a year, 22 children a week are overdosing on opioids. And this is not just people taking fentanyl directly. This is people consuming recreational drugs that they think are safe and are laced with fentanyl.
And how are children, a child could touch it
under
and overdose? I mean, that's how easy it is.
Usually what's happening if the under 20 set is they're consuming recreational drugs, marijuana that has fentanyl, and they're unaware of that. Their friends are unaware of that, and they're overdosing. It's a ongoing cascading tragedy. And it
is cocaine. I've seen cocaine deaths uptick, but then you read the fine print, it's like, well, it's because it's laced with fentanyl.
Right. And that is
it all traces back to fentanyl.
It all traces back to fentanyl. We're talking about the most addictive chemical in human history at the end of the day. And so as I see my communities in my district responding through harm reduction and primary prevention and education, I think that's all great. I'm glad that they're using the opioid settlement funds to do that, but they need backup on the supply side. And that's where you and I come in. The terrific work that you've done, engineering bipartisan focus on disrupting the drug cartels. The work that we're doing on the Select Committee on China is about pairing that with interdiction of Chinese supply, because 97% of these APIs are coming from China. Mm-hmm. And it is entirely preventable, like overnight, if the CCP wanted to, because they're being subsidized and facilitated by state action.
Right.
And that's not an opinion. That is a natural experiment that was carried out during COVID. When China shut down for the COVID closures, fentanyl exports from China plummeted. And actually we saw meaningful improvements in U.S. public health as a result. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously there's a lot of noise there because of the COVID problem, but we know that it works. And now we need China to do it again.
Right. Well, we need to exert some leverage. And that's actually something I want to pick apart there, because that is something that came out of the Select Committee, was not just the idea that the Chinese are actively supporting those companies, but the facts that they were, because that's a question that was always asked to me, just working on the cartel side. Do the Chinese know, or do they not know? And I'm like, I don't really have a perfect answer to that. So how do you know? Or how did that investigation go? Where's the proof there?
And this is publicly available, so people should look it up. Select Committee on China report on CCP fentanyl. And what it is it's really three things. One, the Chinese Communist Party is giving a value-added tax to the chemical manufacturers who are shipping illicit fentanyl precursors. These are APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, that have no commercial use case at all. They're just illegal, and they're getting a value-added tax. They're being subsidized. The CCP officials have ownership stakes in many of these companies.
Yeah.
So they are profiting. And then finally, there is a practice of active neglect by CCP law enforcement when complaints do come in, either from the United States or domestically, about the practices of these companies. So this is an ongoing CCP strategy,
Right.
and it's really state-sponsored poisoning of the United States.
Yeah. And it's fully predictable too. I mean, it's given China's view of the United States in competition with us.
And their own
It's
history with opium.
Yeah.
It is a psychologically resonant issue for the Chinese public. And we see that, I think, with the way that they treat this issue. They basically say, too bad you guys have this problem, but it's not ours.
Yeah.
And we have to make it their problem by, as you said, enacting not just leverage, bone-crushing leverage against the CCP, sanctions, money laundering, customs enforcement.
Yeah, we do. And I think we've failed to do that. What leverage points do you see, actually? I mean, this is I'm sure this is a big conversation topic in the China Select Committee. I mean,
It is.
because I think about that from the cartel side and getting Mexico to act, what's our leverage points? It's a little bit easier to answer that question on Mexico for me, but you guys look at China all the time. What are top 3 points of leverage U.S. policy could change that would get them to act?
I think there's a few things. One would be implementation of much stronger sanctions against these chemical factories. Because if you look at these chemical factories, let's call them 24 of them, the majority of their revenue is not actually coming from the fentanyl precursors.
Right.
It's coming from
general pharmaceutical
from
manufacturers.
things that are illicit. And it is actually not in their business interest to get hit with U.S. sanctions. Second thing would be, and you and I have talked a lot about this very hard, but the money laundering element of this is, if anything, even more pernicious. The Chinese are incredibly sophisticated in how they're helping launder the cartel's money. It looks like Treasury probably has the authorities they need to do it, but we now may need to push Treasury to enact some of these sanctions on financial services institutions that are one step away from the chemical manufacturers. And then the third thing is, Congress should be putting on the table very strong countermeasures against China. I think broadly that a president, either Republican or Democrat, could go to China with and say, I'll take some of these off the table if you do some of the right things, not just fentanyl exports, but also exporting dual-use technologies to Russia, importing Iranian oil, a bunch of things that, like, to the Chinese economy actually don't matter that much, that Xi Jinping could do overnight, and that he just needs the pressure to do.
Yeah. It's a game. It's a delicate
game.
balance. And, there's obviously that interconnectedness with our own trade and how much hurting them hurt us. But
I think the advantage that we have with China relative to the cartels or Russia is the cartels in Russia don't care about global public opinion. China does.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a powerful piece of influence that we have.
That's true. And the global opinion of China has not been doing well.
Cratering.
And then the last 4 or 5 years, what else is, you come to the cartel task force. What else, what other takeaways do you have? I think that we could combine on.
I think what you have helped me and the experts that you've brought in, so much of this is going to be about law enforcement collaboration in a way that is in a gray zone between military and law enforcement, and getting that balance right and doing it in a way that is collaborative with Mexican authorities, does not feel to them as though we are impeding upon their sovereignty, is the opportunity that we have with the new president coming in.
Yeah.
It's clear that AMLO was never going to give us that opportunity, but we have to build out state capacity in northern Mexico to help drain the political capital from these cartels.
Yeah, no, that's certainly a big takeaway, and not one we're close to figuring out. And nobody knows how to answer that. It does require leadership, totally from the top. Where I tell people we're dealing with an insurgency in Mexico, and I need the Mexican government to understand that first, and then we have to have their backs in supporting that. The Colombians have gotten that, I think, for decades. I mean, like you said, you went and worked with them, and I grew up in Colombia, but I never actually did any operations there. I never worked there.
The Colombian SOCOM guys are wired.
Well, yeah, they know what they're doing when it comes to drug interdiction, jungle warfare. Like, yeah, we learned from them.
Totally.
So that must have been really cool.
You say
experience.
insurgency. Do you think that in northern Mexico right now, the cartels are operating as insurgents, or are they operating as corporations that have governance authority? Like, they don't strike me as being a bunch of guys in the back of a pickup truck with AKs. They strike me as like,
well, they're both
businessmen.
right? Yeah, I mean, they're both, and I guess you have to define insurgency. I mean, I kind of just am defining insurgency by a group that is not the government trying to be the government.
Yeah.
They're insurgents. We don't have to think of insurgents as like, raggedy Taliban guys. Like insurgents can be anyone who is fulfilling that role of basically creating shadow governments and shadow authorities, which is what they do. And are they a corporation too? Yes. Like they have all these characteristics.
Are they taking over social services as well?
Yeah.
In some of the
in some of these states for sure. It's who's a member of the cartel? It's like, well, we all are. Like that's how some towns are.
Right.
And I don't know how else to describe that except as an insurgency. And more importantly, if we're going to apply tactics to it, like from an American military perspective, if we're thinking of like counterinsurgency operations, from what I can see in Mexico, like that would work. And I've had that conversation with some Mexican officials at the higher levels, and especially we're coming to the next administration, which does give me some hope for the next administration, wherein, it makes sense based on the problems you have. And they're very similar to Iraq and Afghanistan, actually. And people think those are failures, but I would argue they're failures because we decided to quit.
Those were political failures, not military failures.
I would argue that. Yeah.
And our generation of warfighters has a lot of coin expertise that we can help our Mexican counterparts with.
And they do work if you decide to apply them and commit to them. And the basics are like, okay, so Mexico has a federal system just like us. They have a large country. So whereas provinces, say like Iraq and Afghanistan, there's not a whole lot of differences here. And you have local authorities and you have federal authorities. The local authorities are kind of bought into the cartels. They have to be. It's like, you can blame them all day long. You just call them corrupt. They are corrupt, but it's a plato plomo kind of question for them. It's
the conversation I had with Afghan village elders. We were sitting there and said,
what do you want us to do?
You get to leave, Lieutenant. I stay here, and the Taliban are going to be here next month.
They'll be here the next day. So what did we do? We created what's called VSO, which is Village Stability Operations, where you actually have internal presence there. And we're trying to build up a permanent presence of national police or national military entities. And
it's a much more credible commitment when it's coming from your own government rather than coming from us across.
Okay, come from exactly. And so in Mexico they need the same thing. I'm like, you can't send federal forces, whether that's your Mexican army or they disbanded the national police and made basically a national guard out of them. So it's all the military. You send them on one operation here and there. That's fine, but you're just playing whack-a-mole. You have to have a permanent presence.
Right.
Focus on a state at a time. Completely dismantle that insurgency from within, better equip and support that local police force so that they don't have to take the cartel's money. So they can feel like they can actually stand up to them, which means you have to better fund them. I learned that Mexico spends 0.4% of its GDP on security, law enforcement and military included. And you compare that to like Colombia, which is 4 or 5% of its GDP. Or us, 4 or 5% of its GDP.
One element of this that's I think, investigated though, is it's not just the shipment from the cartels of fentanyl across our border, it's our shipment of guns across their border.
Yeah.
Because we are to a large extent arming the cartels.
Yeah.
And it's exporting some of our own gun violence problems.
Yeah. And, they believe we're doing nothing about that, which isn't really true. And that's a constant thing they bring up. They bring it up every time we meet with them. And they're right. They're not wrong. The irony is, this guy like AMLO, because he's a jerk, will say, it's not our problem. You guys take so many drugs. You have a demand problem. That's not our problem. I'm like, well, you have a demand problem for guns, don't you? So I can use that logic back on you. The difference between us is we're totally willing to attack that supply problem. One of the pieces of legislation or policy proposals that'll come out of this task force, I think, is, we're retiring some of the equipment that's used on northbound traffic at the border. There's non-intrusive inspection devices or whatever they're called. Retiring the old ones. Why not put those on southbound routes so that you can look for weapons? Because those are effective in looking for weapons.
These are like X-ray devices?
Yeah, they're basically those giant things, kind of like what you walk through an airport, those kind of things, but bigger for vehicles. Been using them for years, and there's my understanding from CBPs that they're getting new ones,
just retire
the old ones. Yeah, the old ones on the other side of the road.
Yeah.
There's no reason why we wouldn't look into that. Now, the other thing, the Mexican government isn't always very cooperative in giving us serial numbers, for instance, that we could track back to a dealer.
Aren't there?
So it's a little bit talking out of both sides of their mouth.
We have a pretty good key into which are the gun retailers that are shipping these guns, though, right? I mean, it's a classic power law problem where 5 to 10% of them, I'm sure, are doing the majority of it.
Right. And it's, is it a dealer? Is it a straw buyer? And that's the ATF's job to figure that out. I mean, I'd like the ATF to maybe just focus on that instead of trying to take away our pistol braces.
But I was hoping we were going to finally disagree on something.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah. Because I think that's what ATF should be doing. Looking at these true violations, looking at traffickers, I think.
Well, but I visited the ATF, and they are not able to use the most up-to-date software for tracking down crime guns because of prohibitions from Congress driven by Republicans about their ability to scan the documents from gun dealers who have gone out of business. I mean, it's a major impairment. They literally have all these independent contractors come in, scanning these documents and looking through them by hand, as opposed to being able to do a Google search or a word search, basically.
Yeah, we don't trust them.
You don't.
We don't trust them. I mean, that's the balance. It's like I think there's plenty we can do without scaring some of the Second Amendment folks, because obviously their complaint on that is, okay, the more data you have, the more likely it is that you're coming for my guns eventually, and that's the fear. And some people think it's irrational, but it's still the fear, and it's I think you can do both. I think you can tackle the bag, and we got to figure out how to do both because there's no way we're getting a gun registry. So I think that's the point of this task force, is to figure out what we can agree on and then go for it. I think it'd
be great to get some Republicans on board with some type of more muscular policy regarding guns.
Well, they did already pass I didn't vote for it, but yeah, but it's
it's helped drive homicides down 50% over the last year. It's stopped hundreds of under 21-year-olds who had criminal backgrounds from buying assault weapons.
Yeah, I mean, my point is it's already kind of passed. I'm not sure what other piece of legislation there would be, and we haven't discovered that. I'm willing to hear what would help ATF just go after the bad guys but not hurt the good guys, not infringe on people's Second Amendment rights while also stopping traffickers. I don't know. We haven't discovered an answer to that question exactly yet, but.
Funding
a lot of it was in that bill.
Some of it was. Funding would help for them. I think, you think about the fact that 800 or something like that, basically people with criminal backgrounds who shouldn't have assault weapons, trying to buy assault weapons, were stopped by that bill. It makes you think, what could another bill do? How many other people out there, whether because of red flag laws or safe storage laws, are getting their hands on guns who shouldn't have guns, that we could stop with better laws? Yeah.
You just... Go run into some opposition with that one. I'd rather just stop them at the border, and maybe it's simply higher. Well, I think that's what was in that bill, was higher penalties for somebody who's actually caught with trafficking.
I believe there were higher penalties for straw purchases. Yes.
Yeah, and as there should be. Deterrence matters. I know one of the things we ask law enforcement constantly on the fentanyl issue is, do you have to treat this like a crack cocaine epidemic where simply higher sentencing is a deterrent to somebody deciding to lace that marijuana with fentanyl? And I think it is. I mean, if it becomes a murder charge,
sure,
and as it very well should be, if you're deliberately putting what you might call poison into marijuana and selling it to kids, should that be a murder charge?
I agree with that. I think also you can apply that also to customs enforcement, right? I mean, part of the problem we have is some of this fentanyl, a lot actually, is coming through legal ports of entry and airmail packages, because it's the weight to value ratio is very, very high. Value to weight, is very high. And so put in a FedEx package, put in some sneakers, and it's coming through under the de minimis loophole. And as you've pointed out, and as the Select Committee in China has pointed out, we may just need to make the customs penalties for failing to, for getting caught much, much tougher. It's like a speeding ticket, right? At a certain point, if that speeding ticket gets more expensive enough, people slow down.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I agree. And that's going to be one of our solutions. And I know we've talked about that, but that came from our visit to LA. where the CBP has their Artemis program, and they specifically look at fentanyl precursors coming in through air cargo. And they're like, the problem is we do all this work to actually catch them, which is tough enough as it is.
And it's a slap on the wrist.
And it's, $5,000 fine. So for these companies that we're talking about, and it's not even clear where that fine goes. Is it the cargo company? Is it the, who, I'm not really even sure, but we've got to increase it 1,000-fold. Why not? It doesn't matter.
Cost of doing business.
Yeah. I know you got to go to your next thing, but
it's actually the fentanyl working group I'm going to.
Oh, really? It is?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell them I said hello.
I will.
And okay, so how's your convention? Let's ask one political question.
Sure.
How's the Democrat convention going to go? Is it just sealed? Is Kamala sealed the deal?
She's the nominee. Yes,
it's going to happen.
Yep.
Okay, so then
She has it.
you want to do some raw speculation on her Veep pick?
I do not.
Is it Julianne Louis-Dreyfus?
Here's what I would say. I think that Nikki Haley called it. She said, first party that changes the top of their ticket wins. Because now this election is about the future versus the past.
Do you think she can? Well, I think a lot rides on that Veep pick. I mean,
historically though, a lot doesn't ride on Veep picks.
Yeah,
maybe a state.
This time feels different. I agree with that. I don't know.
If that were the case, then why on earth would Trump choose a VP who narrows rather than expands the base?
I don't know. But that was probably what he thought he was running against Biden. But
he's going to regret that choice.
Yeah. So do you think Kamala can beat Trump?
Yes.
So from a Republican perspective, we want Biden. We wish we had Biden. But Kamala's definitely our second favorite as far as competition. Like
what we are seeing is that, and you and I will disagree about immigration and inflation on a separate podcast, but let's accept as a premise that voters have concerns about immigration and inflation. What we are seeing is that voters are not ascribing those concerns to Kamala, that she has an opportunity to introduce herself to the public and that she can significantly
So in other words, I need to tweet more about Kamala being the border czar.
Well, you guys are going to put the stuff on the floor, trying to tag. It's not going to work, because what we're going to be able to say is, what we are saying is, y'all voted against the bipartisan border security legislation, and that Congress ultimately owns the immigration problem. Congress needs to fix it.
Our counter argument to that is we had it mostly under control just with executive action, and then that immediately changed when all those executive actions were reversed.
You had it under control.
And we put the vice president as the border czar.
She was never given the congressional tools that she needed to actually address that.
But they could have just not reversed the executive actions.
COVID ended. We had the end of the public health
Title 42
emergency.
is only a small part of that.
And
about Remain in Mexico, the silent cooperation agreements. Those are the big ones.
The president was committed to a humane border security strategy. And he was also, I think it's important to note, the biggest disinflation driver over the last 3 years has been immigration. We need people coming in, working in construction and healthcare and retail. And immigration has been a boon to the U.S. economy. Now, there needs to be law and order at the border, for sure.
Yeah.
And we put together the toughest, fairest border security package, and Trump gave one rally speech, and the Republican Party torpedoed it.
Yeah, I don't know about it. I don't know about immigration being the driver of disinflation. I think just simply supply chains recovering is
part of it too.
More
immigration
likely
is a part of it.
But yeah, we're not distinguishing. This is how these conversations always go. We don't distinguish between legal and illegal immigration, but you got to. And if you want more legal immigration, that's a valid policy position to take that we can just debate. Like, okay, what's the number every year? Maybe it should be, because it's about 1 million. Should it be more? Should it be less? Like, that's a debate. But there should be no debate over illegal immigration. It should just stop. It should just be illegal and not be allowed at all. That's sort of our take on it. And I think, and you're telling me I need to tweet more about this because the voters just aren't ascribing to Kamala. So thank you for that advice.
It isn't going to stick.
We'll see.
I think fundamentally, if she can drive a contrast on rule of law, on lower costs in the economy, and on reproductive freedom, Trump is not going to be able to help himself. He is a self-pitying grievance engine, and he is going to just constantly make this election about himself and his own past, and she's going to make the election about your future.
But he's not so far. That was my fear, but he's not so far.
Oh, please, look at his convention speech. He spends 10 minutes grasping at statesmanship, and then the next 80 going off on his tangents about this, that, and the other.
It's a lot better than it could have been. I mean, it's all relative. I feel like I'm pretty objective about Trump, right? And I support him, but I don't suck up to anybody. His behavior is definitely better.
He's running a
And
more disciplined campaign.
way more disciplined.
16, I will
And,
grant
I
you
mean,
that.
and he is leading. And I think as long as he acts like he's leading, and doesn't fall into a trap of feeling you're coming back from behind, it
He's
could
not
be
leading
good.
though, because leaders don't look to their own path.
No, I
They
just
look
mean
to
by the polling.
our
I just
future. Oh, in
mean
the battleground
I just mean
states.
polling. Yeah.
He made a huge mistake with J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is, he's a MAGA shapeshifter, and the one common thread in his career is this hostility towards women. His expressions about, women without children are miserable cat ladies, like that kind of is. It's going to be very off-putting to those Haley voters in the heartland that need to vote for Trump. They're not going to like J.D. Vance when they get introduced to him.
Yeah. No comment. No retort.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for having me on, Jake.
Nice to talk to you.